Hello and welcome to Developing Perspective. Developing Perspective is a podcast discussing news of note in iOS development, Apple, and the like. I'm your host, David Smith. I'm an independent iOS developer based in Herndon, Virginia. This is show number 206, and today is Friday, December 12th. Developing Perspective is never longer than 15 minutes, so let's get started. All right, so if you've been listening to Developing Perspective for some part of the last about 3 years, I think that I've been doing it. You're probably listening to it now in a podcast client. Probably, if my stats are any indication, you're probably listening to it inside of Overcast, which is the vast majority of my downloads. But I'm trying something a bit new today. I'm trying something, if you've been following my work more generally, I'm trying a couple of different things, just creatively myself. And one of those is that I'm also recording this podcast as a video. And I'm not really sure necessarily if having it as a video and being able to see my face and my expressions is really helpful or not. But it's something that I'm trying. It's something that I thought would be interesting to do, to see, as I'm exploring the medium more generally. It's something that I've started doing tutorial videos for WatchKit. I released my second one of those yesterday. And now I'm also trying it on the podcast and just seeing if it does anything to enhance the experience, to see if it makes the video more accessible to a different audience, people who just would prefer to watch something or listen to it inside of YouTube, and just as an experiment. And it's kind of one of the fun things about being independent and being able to kind of just try things and see what I think is interesting. And so that's what I'm doing. All right, so I'm going to get on and now dive into the actual main topic for today's show. And it's kind of an odd thought. And the title for today's episode is going to be, Can the App Store Be Full? And by that I mean, obviously not full insofar as it's a digital marketplace. It's not that it's actually going to run out of space. I think Apple is perfectly capable of buying enough hard drives that they'll be able to store the combined binaries of all apps that ever wanted to be submitted to it. But if at a certain point we hit a different part in the curve, where rather than the App Store continuing to grow and expand in ways that are genuinely benefiting users, are genuinely enhancing the experience for the common for the common customer, if we hit a certain point where that really stops, or at least slows to such a point that it has these tiny little these tiny little blips of innovation, of newness, of freshness, but it's largely overwhelmed by a sea of more of the same. And in some ways, this has got me thinking about the recent App Store review, shenanigans, tempest, fiasco, I don't know what you want to call it, where a bunch of apps from notable developers have been rejected, and there's a whole kind of where it feels like it's another wave of this angst about app review, which I've been doing this for long enough. I've been making apps for about a little over almost 6 years now, I think, and so I'm fairly used to it. But it's and so I'm not going to actually address the details of what's been going on the last couple of weeks directly on the show. I thought about it, but I don't think I really have much to add other than this is the way the store works, and it has been for a while. I like overall app review, so I'm glad that it's there. And you just sort of keep calm and carry on and just keep coding and do the best you can. And that's ultimately the best way to make a living, to enjoy building apps for the store. What I want to focus on, though, is something somewhat similar to this. I've been increasingly starting to wonder if the App Store is kind of full. And that isn't a result of Apple's policies, isn't a result of lack of new APIs or anything like that. But at a certain point, does the App Store is coming close to 1.5 million applications. And if you think back and if you take a step and think about that, like obviously a lot of those are junk. Obviously a lot of those are duplicates. Obviously a lot of those are kind of things that aren't actually useful necessarily. But even if you assume that maybe half of them are useful, a third of them are useful, it's still an insane volume of applications. And so it starts to make me think, at a certain point, it's unrealistic to expect that we will continue to developers will find ways to build new and useful applications for customers. And there are the more niche you go, the more specialized the capability that you want from your application, the more possible it is that you can still make an application. Yesterday, I think it was Workflow, which is an application for building these really crazy actions. It's like this crazy action composer for iOS. was released, and it does some pretty awesome things. I mean, it's not an app that I think I would use, but it's kind of cool to look at. But functionally, I think it will probably only be useful for a vanishingly small percentage of the users on the App Store. I spent this last week. Apple released their sort of their yearly top app lists. So they have the best apps, and they have the most popular apps downloaded. The top free, top paid, top grossing. And they do this every year. And one of the things I like to do is I sit down and look at the free, paid, and grossing and kind of just get a sense of what the store is like. And especially if you spend time looking at the top free list, you get a pretty, a fairly particular view of what the App Store is these days. Because that's probably the most representative view on what a typical user's experience on the App Store is like. Because the free apps are by far the most heavily downloaded. And app stores, but basically it's fairly simple games, mostly free to play, or free with advertising, that kind of thing. Or it's a social network, or things like Facebook or Snapchat, or those types of messaging application, Instagram, things that are about connecting with people. Like that is, I think, by and large, what most people use their phones for. And I'm not sure if that's the case. How at a certain point does the continuing to expect the App Store to be able to grow and expand in the way that it had for a while, is that realistic? Because I know for myself, while I continue to make new applications, the rate at which I'm making things and the rate at which I'm making things fresh and new is certainly slowing down. And some of that's just my interest, and some of that's just it's hard to keep up with an ever-expanding universe of applications. I've kind of learned my lesson, I suppose you could say. But I still wonder about this. And I wonder if it's a better explanation for some of the angst that I kind of, in general, kind of been feeling in the app developer community recently. That there's kind of a lot more of this kind of boo-hooing about, oh no, it's so hard to make a living in the App Store. Oh, maybe I should make Android. They don't have app review. Whatever it is. Like there's another round of latent anxiety about it. And these have happened many times before. It's not something that is particularly surprising to me. I've gone through this many times with many different at times. But at the end, I keep coming back to, like, maybe it's just the App Store is full. Maybe it's just so hyper-competitive that if anything you could imagine could exist, already does exist at this point. If you want to, like, at its core, there are probably only a few dozen types of applications that exist in the App Store. And now we have most of them, now that we have most of them already built. And so what does that mean? Like, what do we do with that? And I'm not really sure. What I'm doing with myself is, it's helping me to feel better about focusing on just doubling down on some of the existing applications I have. So as I'm looking forward towards WatchKit, I'm focusing more on making sure that the things that I have that have had some traction are things that I will continue to invest in, things that I will continue to improve and make better and better, because that's by far the most likely path that I have for continuing to be relevant in the store. Because I already have some sort of leverage there that if someone new came to the App Store and worked with, they wouldn't have. And so it makes sense to try and leverage that and take advantage of it as much as I can. And then also when I think about things that I want to do that are new, it changes a little bit your perspective when you start to think about, it's like if you take as a given that there aren't any new great ideas. And obviously that's a patently incorrect statement. Obviously there are things that haven't been invented yet that will be invented. That's sort of just necessarily true. But the point is not necessarily that things haven't been invented, but that is the extreme outlier, that having success by being truly novel rather than just success by being somewhat boring. And by just building something that is just a good take on a well-defined problem. And that is interesting. Like, I don't know exactly what that means when I get a lot of people who reach out to me and talk to me about they want to make their, they'd love to be an indie in the App Store. That's kind of the dream they have. Or they see what I do and they talk to me and they'll say, like, oh man, what you're doing is living the dream. What you're doing is what I want to do. And it's hard to talk to those people sometimes because I have the understanding that it's very unlikely that you're going to come up with something that is truly new or something that will be adopted just on its own merits, on it being novel and it being interesting. And even if you do, it'll likely be copied very quickly, just the nature of the store. And so if you want to make it in the App Store, it's much more a question of patience, a question of savvy, maybe too, of being really thoughtful about how you're doing things from a business perspective, on keeping your expenses and your costs really, really low. That's one way that I know I've been able to make a living out of this, is that I keep my expenses very low on the development side. I'm a one-man shop. It's just me and the most expensive thing for the most part that it goes into developing an application is that every 2 or 3 years I buy a new computer. Beyond that, it's just my time. And obviously my time is valuable, but my time is not an out-of-pocket expense. And so that helps me keep my expenses really low, which means that even if I don't have huge amounts of income, which I certainly don't, but I have a nice, comfortable living that I can make from the App Store. So that's kind of where I am, and that's what I've been thinking about a lot. And I think, I'm not really sure what the conclusion of this is. It was, like I said, it's kind of more of a random musing. But it's made me think that in some ways the App Store might just be full, that the App Store might just be something that is ever more, it's going to be increasingly harder and harder and harder to make it just on something being fresh. That you have to take as an assumption that anything you build will immediately be copied or already exists in the App Store. And so your success can't be predicated on those things. Your success can't be predicated on something like that. And bringing this back into the app review thing and some of the ways that, like the drama we've had with Today View widgets or with document pickers or all these kinds of applications, is increasingly Apple in their API design and in their SDK design are necessarily, especially on iOS, the Watch Kit is a separate discussion that if I have time I'll squeeze in at the end. But on iOS, they're increasingly making operations whose value is less and less mainstream. And maybe that's a bit controversial to say, but a lot of these things, a lot of extensions, today extensions, sharing extensions, document pickers especially, are things designed for, you could call them power users or whatever. Like they're much more niche and specialized. If you look at the top free list and what the average user's experience on iOS is, they're probably not dealing with a lot of extensions. They're using their phone to text people and take pictures. And so as they push those things more and more niche, it is in some ways also, it shouldn't surprise us that it becomes harder and harder on an app review side for Apple to determine what the right lines are, to determine what the right things that developers should be doing are. And so we just need to calm down and keep moving, I suppose. Like, I don't know, this is one of those developing perspectives that doesn't have a great point necessarily, but it's more just some thoughts that I've been having. That this is the store that we live in now. This is the store that we have. That it's 1.5 million applications on our end with hundreds of millions of customers on the other end, and we're just trying to find a way to grab our tiny little niche. I think it means that we need to be realistic about business models, that things like paid apps and those types of things in a hyper-competitive market aren't necessarily going to be realistic, understanding that the App Store is full of free apps, and so you having a paid app is unlikely to be able to stand out in that context, that whatever it is that you've built, someone else has probably built it and is able to, for whatever reason, to make it free, whether that's because they have a different monetization strategy with ads or in-app purchase, or whatever. But either way, if they have an app that's free and I'm a customer looking at it, I'm going to be thinking about that. And so if you're working in a full store, you have to respond to that and be thoughtful, making sure that you're thinking about it in those terms. And maybe it's a little depressing. It's not quite as fun as when the App Store was empty. But this is the world we live in, and we just need to be realistic about it. All right, that's it for today's show. As always, if you have questions, comments, concerns, or complaints, you can find me on Twitter. I'm _David Smith there. I hope you're enjoying the new formats. If you have any comments on the new formats and the experiments that I'm doing, I'd always appreciate it. Otherwise, thanks. Have a great weekend. Happy coding. Bye.